Welcome back to Starting with IEP. I am your host, Flor de Amelia, and this is episode 31. So if you're a parent who has ever sat in an IEP meeting feeling confused or overwhelmed, or like everyone else in that room knows more than you, then this episode is for you. Today, we are breaking down one of the most misunderstood but powerful parts of the IEP process, your right as a parent. I am joined today again by Dr. Mathews, who has done something that very few professionals do well. She actually makes the process make sense. You'll hear me say that over and over again, how beautifully she puts things. And in this episode, we're talking about what procedural safeguards really are and why most parents ignore them, when you can say yes, and also when you can absolutely say no. We're going to be reviewing what schools don't always explain about evaluations and consent, and how to actually use your rights, not just know that they exist. Because here's the truth. Parents are not just supposed to be sitting quietly at the table. You are not just supposed to be included, you are very essential to this IEP meeting. So if you have ever questioned whether you can speak up, push back, or ask for more, this episode is going to be changing that for you. Before we jump in, grab your notebook because you're going to want to write notes down. And if you find value in this episode, make sure to like, follow, and leave a comment. It helps more parents find this information. Also, don't forget to check out all of our resources at www.startingwithiep.com, where you're going to be finding our IEP coursework, parent workshops, and tools designed to help you walk into meetings confident and prepared. So, all right. Let's get into it. Yay! Thank you so much for returning back. I know from the very first one that we did, it was so nice because you broke it down so beautifully. So I'm really excited for you breaking it down and using parent-friendly language because you're just so good at it. Because when I talk to professionals, I really don't think that they're trying to make a parent or the person that they're talking to, I don't think they mean to make them feel like they don't understand. I think it's just the jargon when they talk to other professionals. They got used to it. So when I was asking you all those questions, you were so good at breaking them down.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so let's get into this and talk about parents' rights and advocacy. The first thing that I was just telling you right before we pressed record that it was first time IEP parents, I guess. I didn't know that it was okay to do certain things. And I guess this conversation would be just normalizing certain things that parents are allowed to do.
Yeah,
Or can
sure.
do. So, from a school psychologist perspective, why is it critical that parents understand their procedural safeguards, not just their child services?
So the procedural safeguards are the document that each state is required to give to parents. And oftentimes they're posted on the school district website. So even if you're not in the evaluation process or the IEP process, parents can usually find the procedural safeguards. And what those are is just outlining the process and the parental rights. So when we talk about doing an evaluation, the procedural safeguards kind of outline the process for the parents, explain the roles of each of the people within the evaluation process, and it gives the parents an understanding of what their rights are. Often parents, I think, don't read those if they're given to them. And I think one of the important things to do as a parent, even just to be aware that document is there, right? So you can always access it and look into it. So again, it's usually posted on the website. If you don't see the procedural safeguards on the school district website, you can always just Google. I'm in Pennsylvania, so I would Google Pennsylvania procedural safeguards and review them as a parent. The other things that are outlined within the procedural safeguards, aside from the parents' right, is if there is a disagreement along the way in the process, what you are permitted and not permitted to do as a parent. So there is different things that you can do within the process if you don't agree with the programming, or if you have concerns about the eligibility. It outlines the contact information of who you can contact if you have significant concerns.
Wow, thank you. I think the most powerful thing, well, there's so many powerful things that you have said, but my favorite thing is that you said it's important for them to be aware. I remember in every meeting, I was like, they give me this thick booklet. Well,
Yes.
for me, it was thick because I get a few pages of copies here and there, and then it's this thick booklet. And they've never explained it to me how you said it. It was like, here's basically like your
Your rights
parent,
as a
yeah,
parent.
rights. When you have time, you can look through it, but never was it shared to me like, hey, we can go through this together. It was just something like here and let's move on.
Can you sign that you've received your procedural safeguards? Because that's big in Pennsylvania. I don't know if that's big in your state, but in Pennsylvania, there's a part of the IEP that says parent was provided with procedural safeguards. And then usually in an IEP meeting, they'll give you your procedural safeguards and then they'll ask you to sign that you received them. And what I have seen as a psychologist in those meetings is oftentimes the parents are given that thick packet and they're like, I don't want that. You know what I mean? They're like, I don't want another piece of paper, but they do ask if you offered them and they sign off of it. That's because there's been like court proceedings that have occurred that if a parent hasn't received their procedural safeguards, that's at the fault of the school district. So that's why it's part of the document in the IEP, actually. And that's why most people presented at the IEP meeting to the family and ask them to sign off right there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's not explained, and you hit upon it correctly, is that within that process, there should be some way that the parents understand that it's important information that they should keep in the event that there's a problem in the future. And also, you should just be aware of what your rights are. Yeah. Within the process. So I would always encourage families to be at least familiar with the document. You don't have to take the big stack of paper. Most of the states have them online, so you could always just Google it. So if you don't want to take it at the IEP meeting and they offer it to you, you can access it online as well.
Yes. I remember once I did say that, but it was like, please let's save paper. Like
exactly.
I have a copy of it and I actually much rather prefer a PDF file because I just got like command find. Yes, I put command find and then I put like the words that I want to know so it can skim it for me to easily access the document,
yes.
making it friendlier for me. I have also made that document into text to speech so it can basically read it out loud for me.
Oh, that's great. Yes. Yeah, that's great. And I'm glad you did that. That should really be accessible to families anywhere, that they shouldn't have to do that extra step. It should be accessible to them because oftentimes when we have a child with a disability, the parent may also have a very similar disability. Mm-hmm. So making that accessible to the family is in different ways, maybe to listen to it, to read it, to have it on technology. I think it's really important.
I made it so because during that time I had to read a lot of research papers when I was doing my doctoral program. That's where I learned because my professor was like, you can turn your PDFs into Audible because I would sometimes turn in things late. And she was like, you have no excuse to turn it late. Oh, I have 5 kids. It's hard. And she knew my commute was about an hour long. So she was like, just
you can listen to it.
And I was like, well, I'm done with all my PDFs for school. Now I just basically turned it so I can listen to the parts that I want to. I'm like, this sounded wrong from what the principal had told me. And because sometimes principals can be wrong, they're humans. So now I just like to listen to certain parts that I want to refresh on. So I thought that would be also really good for parents. I did hear that there are some counties that are really, really, really trying to do like better. So they have put it in different languages, but they have put it not just for the person reading it out loud in different languages, but they actually made a video. The reason why I can't share is because every state is different. I guess I could share for the state of Maryland, but every state is different. And I feel like it should be a project for every state, actually, that they should put this in video and explain it and break it down for each family. Because for a special needs family, finding time, well, sure. I mean, you can find time when there is none, but finding time is hard. And
your mental energy too, and just understanding a document that thick is even if they could present small components of it within a larger sort of presentation, I think would be a great idea. But yeah, I think for parents, they need to know what the rights are. And the procedural safeguards is where you find those rights. And my biggest suggestion, again, is just to be aware of them, have a basic understanding that there's that document you can go to.
I love that. I think the first step is being aware. So
Yep.
thank you. From your experience, what have you seen that parents often underutilize or misunderstood during these IEP process?
I think one of the things that maybe is misunderstood, and I think we touched on this in our last conversation, but the parents are integral pieces
Mm.
of that conversation.
Oh my goodness,
And
yes.
I think that's often lost within the process. And it takes somebody on that educational team, on the school team, to pull that parent in, make them feel comfortable enough to have these important conversations at the table. And so I think that's what parents might often misunderstand, because if they're not familiar with the process, if it's the first time, they don't know where they sit at the table, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Thank you. Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. Well, you made sense. Prior to you, many parents are like, wait, what? So you're making it make sense. And I think when you were speaking, there's so many families that have shared with me saying they're the professionals and the parents don't have a degree. So they're like, I have to accept, but they're their child's best advocate. They're the ones that see it. The teacher is only able to see so many students. So they have a snapshot of your child, but then they see how they work as a group. They may be actually better at knowing them, how they are in a group, but not one-to-one, much more in depth like the parents. But a lot of the times, I just hear a lot of families saying they're not a special ed teacher, so they feel like they can't override basically what the professional on the
Mhm.
table is saying, give a lot of input. They can share the triggers, they can share what motivates their child. There's this one family that I was talking to that said it is so important for the child to communicate what she or he has done wrong because religion is really big. Religion is
Okay.
really, really
Mhm.
big for them and them to get their sacraments done, and confession is one of them. It's just basically admitting to that, but that child couldn't be part of the family gathering or part of their big weekend thing. So the family was like, I really want the speech pathologist to work on this because it's big for our family to do on Sundays. It's a Sunday thing that they do together as a family. And I really liked how the speech pathologist understood how big it was for the family. So now they're doing
Sure.
like they're adapting yes, no questions. So they're teaching the child how to do yes, no questions. Did you do this? Is it true?
Yeah.
That's
And
that's
that's
where
like a life skill that child's going to
Mhm.
need for the rest of their life. It also impacts them educationally. That's a perfect example of how the family
Mm.
provided some really individualized input for that child. And that could also be part of an IEP goal, right? And that's the type of thing that we want to see, because each child should be receiving individualized support as part of their IEP. And so something like that, like a very special thing to the family, individualized for that child, is a perfect example of how a parent can provide that necessary input at the table.
So I guess we answered our actually next question. At what points in the IEP timeline do parents' rights matter the most? Do you consider that being an important part, or is there another one you're like, actually, there's actually another one?
Yeah, so I think there are some other important pieces that parents need to understand. So, first of all, parents do not have to provide consent for an evaluation if they don't feel like they want the evaluation. Okay, so that's your first point. If a school says to parents, we would like to evaluate your child for special education, and for some reason the family feels that's not within the child's best interest, there is a place on the permission to evaluate that the parents can say, no, I do not consent to the evaluation. Okay. So just parents need to know that they can say no at any time.
Can I ask you, why would a parent do that? Why would a parent think that it would be for the child's best interest?
To not have an evaluation.
Yes, I met families that they haven't consented to that. And 4 years later, the gap has widened so much that now they want those services, but the child is much more behind versus, I guess, that would have been earlier intervention type of thing. But
Right.
why would it be for the child's best interest to not receive special education services?
I can't really think of it like a specific example, but I guess what's coming to mind is like the political climate in the world that we're in right now. Families may feel less secure with providing information about the child's background,
Oh, I
status in
see.
terms
I
of
see.
immigration, those types of things. And for the families to understand that they don't have to give consent is one thing. You could say, yes, I want my evaluation. And then at the end of that process, parents can also say, no, I don't want the IEP. So you can have the evaluation, but
I
to
see.
initiate the start of special education services,
I see.
school
I see.
districts also need parents' consent at that point. So
I think that's good that you mentioned that. Yes, yes, yes. Because
yeah, so you
I
could
can see
still
the
get the
parents
evaluation,
so
but then
they can know about their child more information. Because I can understand why maybe the parents' fear of seclusion or some type of segregation from the kids that are
general
typical,
population,
mm,
right,
not
right.
being in the least restrictive environment.
Right,
That might
right.
be a
There
fear of
could be a
theirs.
number of things like just the mistrust that has come. If there's been a lot of disciplinary difficulties up until the process of being evaluated, families may be less inclined perhaps to trust that the school's doing right by the child. So could also be something along that line. But you could also say yes to the evaluation. And then when it gets to is my child eligible, and the team determines yes for special education, you could still at that point say, no, I don't want to move forward with an IEP services. That's your parental right to waive special education services. Okay. So that's another point. Once your child is in special education, parents have a right to consent every 3 years for a reevaluation. But if the school tries to contact you within a reasonable timeline and multiple attempts, and they don't hear back from you, they can do that evaluation without your consent. So just be aware of that. Once you are in special education, they don't need as many consent signatures from you. They can move forward as they would generally do if they are not able to get a hold of you.
Yeah. I spoke to a young man this weekend, and I think he's 16 years old. And whenever I talk to teenagers, I'm just so curious about what are your goals? What's your 3 year, 5 year, 10 year plan? I want to know because when I was young, I had so many ideas. And he's like, I don't know. And I was like, that's okay. Well, what do you like doing? And for him, it was a struggle because he said everything involved reading. And I was like, oh, are you getting supports for that? And he was like, no, the school doesn't help me. I just try to avoid it, but I'm good at math. And I'm like, well, I'm glad that you're good at math. I was like, did you tell your mom about it? And then he's like, my mom works too hard and my dad's always busy too. So he's trying to finish high school. But then I was talking to him saying, hey, you need to talk to your guidance counselor and talk to a trusted teacher and see if there's any accommodations that they can give you. I know that he was having difficulty in reading. We were talking about that comprehension is really hard for him. But that type of scenario makes me so sad because he doesn't think that he's going to be able to go to college because he knows that he's struggling so early on in reading. There's no way college is an option. Even trade school, even though it involves hands, it still involves some type of reading. Very smart
Right,
smart
right.
individual. But it just makes me sometimes sad that I know special education sounds like a taboo type of thing. I feel like they're not as smart as their peers, but it can be something good.
You noticed, I think, a stigma attached to asking for help.
Yeah.
And, that's another reason why parents don't ask for an evaluation. is it can be stigmatizing for a child to be identified with some sort of difficulty, which means they can get some type of support. But the first step is to identify that. And sometimes, because of that stigma, he's avoiding every aspect of school that is hard for him, which is understandable given his circumstances. I worked at a high school for many years, so I'm very familiar with this type of situation. And what I find is we are very quick for kids that get special education services to say their behavior is interfering with their learning. And my first question also always is, are we instructing them at their instructional level? Because if we were, I am sure we would see very few behavioral difficulties. But in the high school systems, in our high schools in the United States, you have to earn a certain number of credits in a certain number of areas in order to graduate. Now, if you have reading difficulties, that's going to be hard for you to get credits in all areas, because we need to read in order to understand math, in order to civics, in order to understand the topics that we're required to obtain as we become graduates. And I think oftentimes we're missing the fact that the child still needs that individualized attention and support so that they can access the curriculum. Otherwise, we might see things like leaving class regularly, spending more time in the bathroom, verbal or physical aggression, because it's an avoidance tactic for children.
I love that you brought all that up because often when I was a teacher, I explained to that because other teachers would get so mad that the student would be leaving. And I'm like, why? But why would they be trying to escape your bathroom? If we were to take data on how many times he leaves the first period, the second period, third, and so on, and you can see which one he's avoiding most. And then we can probably see a trend. Is it always this time? And then we would have to identify what triggers him to want to leave that classroom. Is it the task that is too difficult? I was a science teacher, so I want to say if there was more hands-on, but like
Sure.
the reading or the math would be the ones that we would see the most that they would leave, or history class too, because history also involves a lot of reading. But what you explained, I was like, sometimes they just see it as a behavior. But what caused, again, behavior's not spontaneous, but what has caused this behavior? Why are they doing that in the classroom? And then we should consider that and then go into more testing to see what's going on. I do want to thank you for letting the families know that they can not consent to the evaluations, but can also the parents refuse certain parts of the evaluation? They'll be like, okay, fine, I'll do this evaluation, but can we not do X, Y, or Z? They able to do that?
Yes, they can. So I have had this situation where a family did not want their child to have a cognitive assessment as part of the evaluation. And in that instance, what we did was offer the family the permission to evaluate in the manner that we would typically do for this type of situation. And the parents did not give consent. And then we gave them another permission to evaluate without the cognitive assessment on there. And they gave permission for that. So you can say no to certain aspects of the evaluation. Now, you should also know as a parent that may then affect the outcome of the evaluation. So remember in our previous discussion, we had talked about how certain disability categories look at a part of it is looking at the cognitive functioning of the individual. Like the one that I'm thinking of is specific learning disability and also intellectual disability. Those two pieces of information or these disability categories, they include looking at the cognitive assessment. So in this instance, we were not able to identify the child under those classifications because the family did not want us to conduct the cognitive assessment.
I can understand it.
Yeah, so you can say no. You can say no to, let's say, a functional behavior assessment. If you don't feel like you want that as part of your child's record, you can say no. These types of things you can say no to, but also understand that there may be limits to what the future may hold for your child because we have to consider all the information as to what we have.
So what if the parent says yes, for example, to an FBA, the functional behavior assessment?
Mhm.
Let's just say that they said yes to that. And they're like, actually, thank you for writing it. Thank you for sharing it, but I do not want it in my child's records. Can they do that?
I think there is a way that you can request for it to be removed from your child's record. And I think you'd have to ask each district how to get that removed and the purpose of getting it removed. You should always have access to your child's records. That's part of your right as a parent. But getting it removed once it's there, I think is you would have to go through the administrator in the building to determine how best you can get the things that you need out of there. There is also that there have been instances where sensitive information is shared as part of the evaluation, and the evaluation is available to the individuals who work with your child directly. So parents sometimes may feel worried about some of the information that could be shared in those documents. So I'm always clear with families when I'm going through the evaluation process, like, this is the information that you share with me could become part of your child's educational record. So I will always try to keep that sensitive information confidential, but just so you're aware, this information can be shared with teachers that work directly with your child. So just for them to have that awareness too. There are instances where if for a particular reason things need to be removed from the evaluation, you would want to have that sort of discussion with the evaluator and come to an agreement as to what should and should not be in the record.
I remember at that time I was a history teacher in middle school, and there was this one student that we would be told background information on, for example, that he was sexually assaulted by a family member, but you would not see it nowhere in his written records. But they would tell us this to let us know certain things may trigger him. He has a lot of trauma, and for the teachers to be a little bit more sensitive towards him. But yet, nowhere in his documents was it written, and mom specifically asked that to be done that way because later on, if he chooses to read his document, she was just afraid that may trigger. So she just had to share that with the staff, always requesting not for it to be added in the document.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And I could see the other side of that too, because I recently evaluated a child who was sexually assaulted by her father, and it played very much into presenting problem for the child and the reason for the evaluation. So there are ways that we can share that information in written format that maybe is more sensitive and maybe more general, so that, let's say, goes to another school district, the parent doesn't have to have that conversation over and over and over again with school.
Hard
That's
conversation.
traumatizing for the parent too.
Yeah.
So anyway, I could see that it might be written in the records, but in a very specific and sensitive manner, which is how I chose to provide it in the report. And I had that specific discussion with the parent because I said, this plays directly into the presenting concerns and the reason why we're doing the evaluation. So I do think it's really important information that is in her written document. And we came to an agreement as to what type of language I would use and how I would share that information. And so she was comfortable with that. But I think it's important that the parent needs to disclose that information when they feel comfortable and in which manner they feel it would be best for that situation.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I remember I had another interview and then he was like, we can just make it, we state it. I think he used the word generalize it to make it a little bit more broader, but not so much details. Like the parent may provided
Sure.
a lot of details, but
Of course.
just enough for the reader to understand, but not too much that it can be too invasive for the family.
Exactly. Even a simple statement of there's family history of trauma. That could mean a million different things, right? I think choosing the appropriate language, and then also when you're doing the evaluation, this always goes back to the whole process of the evaluation. you're always having those conversations with families so that they feel that they're comfortable throughout the process.
Yes. And I think the reason why I was asking you about the things that parents would say, but there's also things that parents would not know, right? For example, when you do an assessment, you would ask them questions and then they would be like, wait, I didn't know everything I'm going to say. Because I know that in the beginning, you might tell them, not that you might, I know that you would be telling them that this is for the assessment. But sometimes parents are so nervous in the beginning and they
Mhm,
don't hear the beginning part. And then they're like, can you
mhm,
actually, after they read the report, they are entitled to ask them, can you please remove this statement?
or adjust it in any way. And yeah, I mean, usually people are open to having that conversation. And as long as you have a reason for
Reason.
it, I think it's appropriate to ask. And then you come to some sort of agreement because that is the document that's moving forward with your child. It's important to have those conversations. And I think you bring up a good point for us school staff is to have the conversation about what's included in the records multiple times with families through the process because they might miss it. And so to reiterate it and repeat it throughout the process, for me, I'm going to take that away as that's the part I'm taking away to make my practice better is to make sure that I say it multiple times so the families truly understand it throughout the process.
Yeah. Yes. I remember once I was talking to a mom and it was just so much for her to handle. And she was just sharing that she just no longer wanted to be a parent. She no longer wanted to be a parent because of how stressful this was. And then she was asking, like, is there a place where she can send her child because she felt that she was no longer fit for a parent? Because she was giving me a lot of details. And then I was asking her, this is the type of stuff that you want me to add and you want me to help you support it. And then she was like, I'm just going through a lot. So after that one, I did help her seek like mental help for her too because she was going through a lot. But we did
Right.
follow along. Once she got the help, she was just saying like she really hoped that not a lot of that information was there. She was just really in a vulnerable state and she hasn't talked to another adult. It's just sometimes parents they tend to overshare because they don't have another
Someone else to share that with. Yeah, they don't have
which
another source to lay all that out there, which I think that's another important piece of it is like families, if they need their own
hmm
support, that they should be able to access
hmm
supports because just having a child with a disability is stressful enough.
yeah.
And then on top of it, having to understand your rights within special education is a whole nother level of stress that can be added while you're trying to get support for your child.
Yes. Thank you again so much for you letting me know about that they can refuse parts of it. And the reason why I was also asking you, because I remember you were talking about that there was this parent that said not to do the IQ part of it.
Mhm.
But what if a parent didn't know that in that assessment, that was that section, which is why I was asking, was like, well, after you do the testing and they see it and they're like, oh no, I didn't want you to do that part because they didn't know the subsections of the assessment. But no, thanks for telling us that they just have to give a reasoning and then they would
Mhm.
ask.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
then how can parents go about to request specific assessment and how should they frame those requests to be taken seriously? But for me, it's also like, but how do they know what to ask?
Yeah, so I guess it would depend on what specific assessment you're looking
Looking
for.
for.
And so when you get your permission to evaluate is when they list what assessments they're going to do. So you give your consent for all of those listed assessments. So I would suggest to parents when you get that permission, you want to look at the list of assessments that they're offering to your child and make sure whatever that you want or do not want is within that list so that in the future when the evaluation comes out that you know exactly what you're getting and what's included as part of the evaluation.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I do like that you broke it down that they can ask for that. But what does it mean for a parent to have the right to access educational records, and how can that right be strategically used? Sorry, that was like a 2-point question.
So parents do have the right to review children's records, and you would just need to request that. So in the instance of an evaluation, let's just take for instance of an evaluation. Some parents want to look at the test protocols that we as psychologists use to understand where the scores lie and understand where the child performed compared to other children their age. And because most parents don't have a background in psychological assessments, we as psychologists are sort of required to secure the test. So we can give general understanding to parents about where your child performs, but in the instance where they want to inspect the protocols that we use when we do the assessment, somebody would have to sit with the parents while they reviewed it. Okay, just so that the family is aware. And this doesn't happen often. That a parent wants to look at the protocols that we use for the assessments, but they can request it. And if that is their desire, just for them to know that somebody that is trained in psychological assessments may sit with them to secure the test protocol. And that's our obligation ethically and for test security.
When you mean to secure it, meaning like the parents don't take pictures of it or trying
to take specific questions. Let's take, for instance, gifted eligibility. So in every state, giftedness is deemed differently. So I'll talk about it from the stance of Pennsylvania. You have to have an IQ score of 130 or above. And you also have to meet certain criteria in order to qualify. Those are instances, if your child's not eligible or maybe even is eligible, that parents request to look at the protocol to make sure that the child gets every potential score that they could correctly. And so some of that, because we are trained in the assessment, if a parent looks at the protocol for that, they might not understand something. So that's why we're there to explain the reasoning behind it, and for also to manage the test security so that the families are like, oh, questions like what is the and what is this, those are all on the test, so make sure your child knows about that. Those are instances where we might think, and that's a different type of special education, but gifted support is within the scope of special education in some states. So just so that they're aware that they can request those types of things and look at the records, they can request that at any time.
Thank you. I didn't know actually that there would be another trained person there while that was going on.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, you need to keep it secure. Yes.
Right.
How far in advance should a parent receive evaluation reports, and why does timing matter?
So every state is different. Once again, I would look in your procedural safeguards. Oftentimes that those timelines specific to your state are outlined within your procedural safeguards. But oftentimes, let's take, for instance, in the state of Delaware, we talked about how eligibility is really a team decision. So whereas I might have a draft sent to a family within a couple days before the eligibility meeting, it's not required by law. Okay. But I do that sort of as best practice so the family can read through the data that we've collected and understand maybe what eligibility categories we're looking at. And so I provide that through a draft of the evaluation after the eligibility meeting, where we talk about what the child may be eligible for in terms of services and classification. That's when I would send you the finalized document of the evaluation. So that really comes after our eligibility team decision. In Pennsylvania, it works a whole different way. So in Pennsylvania, the psychologist is generally making the determination for special education prior to any meetings with the team. So it does land mostly on the psychologist to make that determination because that's what we're trained in. And so the parents generally will receive that evaluation before their scheduled IEP meeting. And in my experience, we don't have a separate eligibility meeting with parents if they are eligible for special education. So I might send you the report before your IEP meeting, or if the child's not eligible for special education, I might offer a meeting. But in Pennsylvania, you're not required to have a meeting if the child is not eligible for special education.
Yes, I think that's going to be hard for some parents to understand. And I'm so grateful that you're saying this is state by state. So, Pennsylvania families, yes. Other
Yeah.
families, we got to do our research.
Yeah, and I think that's important. So just so you families understand too, school psychologists in every state are overworked and we're understaffed. There's a national shortage of school psychologists. So whereas we try to do our best to get the information to families within a good timeline so that they have the information, there are instances where we have so many things to do that we can't get you that information before the meeting. And so just to have an understanding of where school psychologists are coming from too, because there is a national shortage and it can be very challenging to be a school psychologist within our current education system. So if you don't get the report beforehand, or if you need more time to review it, you as a parent can always say, look, I just got this report. I don't have the time to review it. Can we reschedule our meeting until next week? And that's something that parents can always request if the information doesn't get to you in a timely manner.
Yeah. Yes, there's so many parents that they don't have time to read the report. And then during the meetings, they're like, they said a lot, had a lot of questions, but the reason why they didn't ask because they were just afraid that the psychologist would be like, well, if you read the report, which I know the psychologist wouldn't say that, but they were just afraid that that would be like the comeback. It's all the answers are in the report.
Right. And the reports can be confusing, right?
Yes. Yes.
So one of the things that I've been trying to do is kind of change the language of my evaluations too. There's a way that you can make it more accessible to families. And generally speaking, psychologists write the reports at 16th grade level. So if families don't reach that level of education, we really need to make the reports accessible. So there's a way that I've started to write my reports. I always check the overall readability or the grade level to see if I'm making it accessible and reducing the technical jargon that can be seen in some of the evaluations. And that's just my process over working in the field for many years. Younger psychologists may be more inclined to use that jargon because we need to present technically sound evaluation. But I think there is an art to making it more accessible to families and also holding up that technical piece of it.
Yes, yes. And families need to get used to or just normalize it more, asking those questions, especially if you finally have their time, you have them in front of you, please, because they're just so busy, right? Like you said, they're so busy. This is the time during the meeting is to ask them all the questions since you have them right in front of you.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Ask your questions. It's not wasting anyone's time to ask the questions that you need to ask.
If there's one thing I want you to take away from today's conversation, it's this. Knowing you're right is not optional. It's your responsibility as your child's advocate. And I'm not saying this in a pressured-filled type of way, but in a powerful way. Because once you understand what you can ask for, what you can refuse, and how the system actually works, that's when everything changes. You stop feeling intimidated and you start showing up differently at that IEP table. So here are your action steps. Take 10 minutes of this week and look up your state's procedural safeguards. You don't have to read the whole thing. I just want you to get familiar with it. Awareness is always step one. And if this episode has helped you, please don't forget to like, follow, leave a comment, and share this with another parent who needs to hear this. And don't forget, you are not alone in this. For more support, tools, and step-by-step guidance, please go to www.startingwithiep.com, where you will find our IEP courses, workbooks, and upcoming trainings designed specifically for parents navigating this process. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode of Starting with IEP. Bye.